My parents walked into the courthouse that morning to save the son they considered their final pride. They thought the daughter who quit the Navy was an old stain erased from their lives. But when those doors swung open and I walked in wearing my dress whites covered in medals, over 10 years of lies detonated, the absolute biggest shock was not that I never quit, but the heavy price they paid to feed that lie. My name is Lillian Moore. The air inside the federal courthouse in Port Rowan, North Carolina, always tasted like polished wood, stale coffee, and cold desperation. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 9 o'clock. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with local business owners, journalists from the county paper, and curious townspeople. At the defense table sat Grant Moore, my older brother, the golden boy of our coastal hometown. He wore a navy blue suit that probably cost $3,000, custom tailored to project the exact image he sold to the world: the dependable, self-made owner of Harbor Shield Recovery, a post-hurricane restoration empire currently under federal investigation for massive contract fraud. From my vantage point just outside the heavy oak doors, looking through the narrow pane of reinforced wire glass, I could see them sitting directly behind Grant, Warren and Judith Moore, my parents. They sat tightly together in the front row of the gallery, serving as the stoic bedrock for their besieged son. My father wore his best Sunday suit, his jaw tight, projecting a fierce, righteous indignation on behalf of his boy. He looked like a man ready to fight a war for his son's honor. My mother clutched a worn leather handbag in her lap, her knuckles completely white from the strain. They were there to protect their family. The family they thought they had. In their minds, I was a ghost. To them, I was the frail, disappointing daughter who simply could not hack the military. The girl who cracked under the intense pressure of basic training, sent a few ashamed, desperate emails, and vanished from the family tree over 12 years ago. My name was practically a banned word in their pristine household. If anyone in our small hometown ever brought me up at a Sunday barbecue or a church bake sale, my parents offered a tight, practiced smile and a vague comment about how I was finding my way somewhere out west, far away from the rigorous standards of the Moore family. They had spent more than a decade mourning a profound failure that never actually happened. Inside the courtroom, Grant was playing his part to absolute perfection. He leaned over to whisper to his high-priced defense attorney, nodding with a practiced, solemn gravity. He was the local hero who rebuilt ruined houses after the devastating coastal storms, the man who brought millions of dollars in federal relief to our struggling county. But from my hidden spot, I noticed his hands. His fingers twitched erratically against the solid mahogany table, and every 30 seconds, his eyes darted toward the double doors at the back of the room. Grant was terrified. He was the only one in that expansive room who knew the foundation of his entire empire was built on a ticking bomb, and he knew the timer had just run out. It was time. The bailiff signaled the prosecution table. The lead federal attorney, a sharp, unyielding woman named Sarah Vance, stood up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the government calls its next witness." I pushed the heavy oak doors open. The massive brass hinges groaned, a low metallic sound that immediately cut through the low murmur of the crowded gallery. I stepped over the threshold. The courtroom floor was laid with highly polished marble. My regulation leather Oxfords struck the cold stone, one crisp, sharp crack after another. The rhythm was absolute. The rhythm was born of strict discipline and thousands of hours of marching. It was a sound that demanded attention. I was not wearing the wrinkled civilian clothes of a disgraced, cowardly runaway. I was wearing my navy dress whites. The high choker collar snapped perfectly around my neck, forcing my posture into rigid perfection. The fabric was immaculate, blindingly bright under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal building. On my shoulders rested the hard gold shoulder boards indicating the rank of a senior officer. On my left breast, a dense, colorful stack of ribbons and medals caught the light, silently testifying to deployments, commendations, and a life of rigorous service they knew absolutely nothing about. The sound of my measured footsteps made people turn their heads. My mother turned first. Judith Moore looked casually at the center aisle. expecting to see a government auditor or an FBI agent. Her eyes tracked up from the gleaming white shoes, up the pristine, creased trousers, up the shining brass buttons, and finally landed squarely on my face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The worn leather handbag slipped off her lap. It hit the wooden floor with a heavy, echoing thud, the metal clasp loudly clacking against the floorboards. The sharp noise jerked my father out of his intense focus on the judge. Warren Moore turned his head. He looked visibly annoyed at first, irritated by the clumsy disruption in the middle of his son's trial. Then he saw me. He saw the face of the daughter he had confidently written off 12 years ago. His entire body went rigidly stiff. He half stood from his wooden bench, his knees locking halfway up as if gravity had suddenly increased tenfold. All the blood drained rapidly from his face. He was completely paralyzed. He was staring at a phantom perfectly materialized in full military regalia. At the defense table, Grant finally looked back over his shoulder. He did not look surprised. He looked utterly destroyed. His face turned the sickly color of wet ash. The false, arrogant confidence evaporated instantly, leaving behind the hollow, panicked shell of a desperate man who realized the long game was finally over. He knew that my mere presence in this uniform was enough to shatter the greatest lie he had ever told, the lie that bought his company, the lie that funded his lifestyle, the lie that stole my life and my family. The gallery was entirely silent now. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at the empty seat they had presumably saved for family friends or supporters. I walked straight past their row. I could feel the intense heat radiating from my father's shock, hear the shallow, rapid, panicked breaths of my mother trying to process an impossible sight. I kept my eyes locked forward, cold, unmoving. I walked right past the wooden partition that separated the spectators from the legal arena. I did not walk to the gallery seating. I walked to the front of the room. I walked straight up to the witness stand, the elevated area reserved strictly for the government's key witnesses. The federal judge watched me approach, his expression neutral but highly attentive. The defense attorney looked sideways at Grant, visibly confused by his client's sudden physical and mental collapse. I stepped up into the wooden box. I remained standing at attention. I raised my right hand, swore the binding oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then I sat down. I smoothed the sharp crease of my white trousers. I looked directly across the room at my brother, letting him see the absolute ruin coming for him. Prosecutor Vance walked slowly toward the podium in the center of the room. She arranged her files, intentionally taking her time, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out across the entire courtroom. She looked up at me, giving a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of readiness. "Please state your name and title for the record," Vance said, her voice echoing with crystal clarity through the microphone. I leaned slightly toward the microphone. I spoke clearly, projecting my voice so that every single syllable would bounce off the back walls and ring permanently in the ears of the two people sitting frozen in the front row. Lillian Moore, Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, currently serving as Senior Logistics Officer for the Atlantic Material Readiness Directorate. Behind me, I heard a sharp, choked gasp. It sounded like my mother had forgotten how to breathe and was drowning in the dry air. Every single word out of my mouth was a public, resounding slap across the face of the false narrative they had swallowed whole. Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy, Senior Logistics Officer, Atlantic Material Readiness Directorate. It was an entity they had never heard of, a rank they never in a million years thought I could achieve, a triumphant reality they had blindly rejected. The prosecutor continued, her eyes sweeping briefly over the shocked gallery. "And how long have you served in the United States Navy?" "Commander Moore." 12 years, I replied, my voice steady, betraying absolutely no emotion. "Continuous active duty. I have never resigned, and I have never been separated from the service." The silence that followed was completely deafening. It was the physical sound of a decade of cruel deception crashing down on a family. Sitting up there on the elevated stand, feeling the burning, confused stares of my parents boring into the back of my neck. The real question hung over the entire room like a sharp guillotine waiting to drop. If I had never quit, if I had been faithfully serving my country this entire time, then who had built the elaborate, suffocating fake life they believed in? Who had meticulously forged the emails, the discharge papers, the pathetic story of my shameful breakdown? And the most agonizing question of all, why had my own family let that lie steal 12 years of our lives without ever bothering to look for the truth? To understand how a lie of that magnitude could take root and flourish, you have to understand Marlow Inlet. It was the kind of small coastal North Carolina town where family reputation functioned as an unwritten law. You were not just judged by your own individual actions. You were constantly weighed against the long history of your last name, and the Moore name carried significant weight. For over 40 years, my family had owned and operated Moore Marine Supply, the sturdy, weather-beaten brick building sitting right on the edge of the main harbor dock. We sold rigging, heavy engine parts, and marine-grade sealant to commercial fishermen and weekend sailors alike. We were a fixture in the community. My father, Warren, was a man carved from salt and pure stubbornness. He operated his entire life on a strict, unyielding code of personal discipline. To him, true dignity meant doing the right thing, keeping your given word, and above all else, never bringing an ounce of shame to the family doorstep. He woke up at 5 o'clock every single morning, opened the heavy steel doors of the store at 6, and firmly believed that grueling hard work was the only acceptable apology for any mistake. He was not an intentionally cruel man, but he was entirely rigid. He viewed the world in absolute terms of right and wrong, success and failure. My mother, Judith, possessed a much softer speaking voice, but a far more brittle spirit. She was perpetually anxious about how we appeared to the outside world. Her daily life was carefully measured by her social standing in the First Presbyterian Church, the approving nods from the neighbors, and her desperate ability to deflect the seemingly harmless, yet deeply probing, questions of a small-town community. To Judith, a public scandal was infinitely worse than a private tragedy. A quiet tragedy earned you sympathy casseroles left on the porch. A loud scandal earned you vicious, lingering whispers in the grocery store aisles. Then there was Grant. My older brother was the undisputed golden boy of Marlow Inlet. He was effortlessly handsome, possessed an athlete's natural grace, and had a brilliant smile that could disarm a hostile creditor in seconds. Grant knew exactly how to talk to people, how to make them feel deeply important, and how to slide out of any trouble with a well-timed, self-deprecating joke. He was far better at selling a compelling story to an audience than actually living an honest life. People naturally gravitated toward him, always eager to buy whatever narrative he was pitching that day. I was his exact opposite. I was quiet, deeply introverted, and intensely organized. I did not possess a single drop of Grant's easy magnetic charm. I did not know how to make people like me in the first 5 minutes of a conversation. Instead, I found profound comfort in the predictable certainty of architectural blueprints, strict inventory schedules, complex machinery, and heavy accounting ledgers. If an outboard motor needed completely stripping down, I could do it. If the quarterly tax paperwork was a massive, tangled mess, I could organize it flawlessly. I was the kind of person an organization could blindly rely on to keep the entire engine running, even if absolutely no one ever noticed me doing the actual work. In the unspoken, deeply ingrained architecture of our family, the future was already mapped out with permanent ink. The quiet assumption was that when Warren eventually grew too old to work, Grant would seamlessly take over the public face of the business. He would shake the hands, close the lucrative deals, and drink cold beers with the harbor master. I, naturally, would remain hidden away in the cramped, windowless office at the back of the store. I was supposed to silently shoulder the crushing burden of the paperwork, the terrifying profit margins, the massive supply orders, and all the grueling, invisible labor that no one else wanted to touch. Growing up, I felt fundamentally essential because of my utility, yet completely unseen as a human being with my own distinct, independent aspirations. I was just the ledger keeper, I was reliable background noise. That all changed the year a massive Category 4 hurricane tore straight through Marlow Inlet. I was 19 years old. The storm ripped the shingled roofs off houses, flooded the lower harbor under 8 feet of murky storm surge, and completely severed our isolated town from the mainland for nearly 2 solid weeks. When the howling wind finally died down, the immediate aftermath was a chaotic, terrifying mess. There was no electricity, no clean drinking water, and no clear direction from local leadership. While Grant stood around the damaged town square, offering very sympathetic words and entirely empty promises to our devastated neighbors, I watched the real, tangible work happen. I stood on the edge of the highway and watched the military and federal response teams roll into town in massive convoys. I was entirely captivated, not by the dramatic tragedy of the destruction, but by the sheer, cold mechanics of the recovery effort. I witnessed high-level logistics in action. I saw exactly how a well-disciplined supply chain, a crystal-clear chain of command, and rigorous organization decided who received critical food, who got emergency medical attention, and ultimately, who was saved first. It was a brutal, beautiful symphony of order imposed upon utter chaos. I realized right then, standing in the mud of my ruined hometown, that I did not want to spend the next 40 years balancing the books for a small-town boat shop. I wanted to be a vital part of that massive, unyielding machinery. I wanted a life completely defined by strict, objective standards and measurable merit, not by small-town gossip or my brother's towering, unearned shadow. I wanted to join the United States Navy. I kept the radical thought locked tightly inside my chest for 3 long months, carefully researching requirements, studying manuals, and physically preparing my body. Finally, on a quiet Tuesday evening in November, I brought it to the dinner table. The roast chicken was halfway gone when I set my metal fork down on my ceramic plate. I looked squarely at my father and told them my plan. I told them I was going to enlist, that I specifically wanted to work in logistics and supply readiness, and that I had already scheduled a formal meeting with a recruiter over in the next county for the following morning. The absolute silence that fell over the dining room was heavy and instantly suffocating. It stretched on for 10 seconds, then 20 agonizing seconds. The only sound left in the entire house was the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the hallway. My mother froze with her water glass suspended halfway to her mouth. Grant raised a single eyebrow, a dismissive smirk playing right at the corner of his lips, as if I had just told a poorly constructed, ridiculous joke. Nobody in that room believed the quiet, socially awkward ledger keeper wanted to step into a physically demanding world that required immense public grit. They looked at me as if a piece of the dining room furniture had suddenly spoken up and demanded a dramatic career change. "The Navy," my mother finally whispered, her voice laced with a thick mixture of utter confusion and immediate, preemptive embarrassment. "Lillian, girls like you do not join the military. What will the people at church say? It sounds like you are just running away from your responsibilities here." "I am not running away from anything," I replied, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady. "I am moving toward something I actually want to do with my life." Grant leaned far back in his wooden chair, casually folding his arms across his broad chest. "Come on, Lily." Basic training, the constant yelling, the rigorous physical fitness tests. You get visibly stressed out when the monthly inventory count is off by 2 life jackets. You really think you can handle a massive drill instructor screaming directly in your face at 4 in the morning? I ignored him completely. I kept my eyes locked dead on Warren. My father was the only opinion that truly held weight in that house. He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. I could practically see the heavy gears turning in his head. He was silently evaluating my worth, my physical resilience, and the potential risk to his pristine public reputation if I failed. He did not see a daughter bravely stepping out of her comfort zone. He saw a massive potential liability. Finally, he placed both of his large, calloused hands flat on the wooden table. He leaned forward, his facial expression stern and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "The military is not a fun summer camp. Lillian," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that demanded absolute attention. "It is a severe commitment. It requires a solid spine." "I know exactly what it requires," I answered. He stared deeply into my eyes, aggressively searching for a flicker of weakness he fully expected to find there. When he did not see it, he offered his final verdict. It was a sentence meant to be a rough blessing, but it was forged as a strict, unyielding contract. "Fine," Warren Moore said, "but hear me right now. If you start this, do not quit halfway. No matter how incredibly hard it gets, do not come crawling back here crying because you decided it was too tough. If you walk out that front door to put on a uniform, you better make sure you wear it to the very end. If you start, do not quit halfway," he repeated. I nodded once, accepting his rigid terms without a single second of hesitation. I did not know it then, but those exact words, spoken across a quiet family dinner table, would eventually become the very knife my brother would use to carve me out of their lives completely. The bus ride away from the coastline felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for 19 years. Arriving at Recruit Training Command in Great Lakes, Illinois, was a profound physical shock, but psychologically, it was the exact sanctuary I had always craved. The military did not care about my lack of conversational charm or my inability to easily navigate small-town social politics. They cared that my rack was made perfectly with hospital corners, that my boots reflected light, and that my issued rifle was flawlessly clean. I thrived in the rigid, unyielding structure of naval regulations. Every single day was meticulously mapped out from 0400 to 2200 hours. There was a clear, objective metric for success and failure. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely liberated from the subjective, shifting expectations of my family's household. During those first 6 months, I maintained a steady, if somewhat brief, line of communication with home. I wrote short, factual letters on Sunday afternoons. I sent quick emails whenever I had authorized computer access. I made hurried phone calls from the base banks of payphones that rarely lasted more than 5 minutes. Surprisingly, my parents seemed receptive to this new dynamic. My mother even mentioned during one call that she had proudly told the Sunday congregation at the First Presbyterian Church that her daughter was currently serving in the United States Navy. For a fleeting, fragile window of time, I actually believed that physical distance and a government uniform had finally earned me my father's genuine respect. But while I was deeply immersed in learning the intricate details of supply chain management and material readiness, my brother was actively drowning in his own unchecked ambition back home. Grant had impulsively decided to launch his new company, Harbor Shield Recovery, just 3 months before the start of the heavy Atlantic hurricane season. He aggressively wanted to secure lucrative state and federal rebuilding contracts, but he had a massive, looming problem. He had completely exhausted his personal lines of credit, and the regional banks were demanding substantial real estate collateral before they would even consider approving a commercial loan of that massive magnitude. He needed money immediately. He also clearly realized that leveraging the concept of a veteran-owned family business would give him a massive, undeniable advantage in the upcoming bidding wars. Most importantly, he needed absolute, undisputed control over the 70 acres of prime waterfront marshland our late grandfather had left jointly to both of us. As long as my legal name remained firmly on that property deed, Grant could not leverage the land for the massive capital he desperately needed. He needed my signature, or far better yet, he needed me entirely removed from the legal and financial equation. Grant possessed a highly dangerous kind of intelligence. He was not academically brilliant by any metric, but he was a masterful, ruthless opportunist. He knew the internal mechanics and digital habits of our family home perfectly. He knew that my mother still frequently used the bulky first-generation tablet computer I had left behind on the kitchen counter. He knew I had never bothered to log out of my secondary, personal email account on that specific device. He also knew exactly which locked filing cabinet in the back office of the marine supply store held my father's meticulously organized folders, complete with dozens of my old, authentic signatures on high school permission slips and minor tax documents from my teenage years. Furthermore, My brother understood a fundamental, exploitable weakness in our parents. They were entirely ignorant regarding the massive bureaucracy of the federal government. They did not know the vast difference between a standard reassignment order and an administrative separation. So, Grant began to meticulously construct an alternate, devastating reality. He started small to build a believable foundation. While I was deployed on my first major sea trial, spending 4 straight weeks completely disconnected from civilian communication networks, Grant quietly logged into that old tablet. He drafted several desperate emails from my account, sending them directly to his own business inbox. The messages were perfectly crafted to sound like a terrified, mentally broken version of me. "Grant, I cannot do this anymore." One fake email read, "The intense pressure is destroying my mind. I am failing my evaluations every single week. Please do not tell Mom and Dad yet. I am so deeply ashamed of myself." He let those fake digital trails sit for 2 full weeks to establish a credible timeline of despair. Then, using basic digital editing software he downloaded on his office computer, he forged an official-looking Department of the Navy document. It was a fabricated notification of administrative separation, explicitly citing my supposed failure to adapt to strict military standards and severe psychological distress. He cropped, copied, and pasted my authentic signature from an old scanned tax document right onto the bottom line. To the untrained, fearful eyes of a civilian boat mechanic and his socially anxious wife, the federal watermarks, the official seals, and the dense legal jargon looked absolutely terrifyingly flawless. Grant waited patiently for a quiet Sunday evening. Precisely when my father was most relaxed in his armchair and my mother was organizing the upcoming week's schedule, he walked slowly into the living room, clutching a printed stack of papers, his handsome face arranged into a flawless mask of deep, agonizing sorrow. "I am so incredibly sorry to bring this to you both," Grant told them, his voice cracking with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "Lily reached out to me a few weeks ago. She has been struggling in secret for months. She completely broke down." He laid the printed emails and the forged separation papers flat on the wooden coffee table. He stepped back and watched his poison work. He explained in a hushed, sympathetic tone that I had been quietly discharged, that I was too humiliated to call them directly, and that I had tearfully begged him to be the sole messenger of my absolute failure. "She is staying on a friend's couch out in California right now," Grant lied smoothly, weaving the trap tighter. "She is just looking for a basic waitress job to survive. She specifically asked that we do not contact her until she is back on her feet. She is incredibly fragile right now. If you push her, Dad, she might do something drastic and permanent." That last sentence was the absolute masterstroke. It heavily weaponized my mother's deepest maternal anxieties and completely neutralized my father's natural instinct to immediately demand answers. Because I was out in the middle of the ocean with 0 cellular service, my subsequent failure to answer their frantic, confused phone calls over the next 48 hours provided all the undeniable proof Grant ever needed. The extended radio silence permanently sealed my fate. My mother believed the heartbreaking story almost immediately, because the paperwork looked so intimidatingly official and Grant sounded so protective. My father violently resisted for exactly 3 days. He paced the hardwood floors, intensely angry and deeply betrayed. But ultimately, he actively chose to believe Grant's lie because it was infinitely easier to digest than the truth. To Warren Moore, a daughter who tried and failed out of weakness was a massive disappointment. But a daughter who failed and then hid like a coward validated every single negative, restrictive assumption he had ever held about my character. His rigid pride simply could not tolerate the terrifying idea that I was successfully thriving in a world he deemed too tough for me. Instead of fighting for my truth, they accepted my complete surrender. By the time my ship finally returned to port and I regained access to my civilian phone, the narrative back in Marlow Inlet was already set in cold stone. I saw several missed calls from my parents, but strangely, no voicemails. When I finally tried to call home, sitting on my bunk with a sense of dread pooling in my stomach, My father answered on the second ring. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about my deployment. "Grant told us everything," my father said, his voice as cold and hard as frozen iron. "We saw the discharge papers. I told you not to quit. I told you not to embarrass this family. Do not bother coming back here until you are ready to look me directly in the eye and apologize for lying to us." Before I could even process the absolute, dizzying absurdity of his harsh words, the line went dead. I stood completely frozen on the pier later that afternoon, the salty wind whipping across my face, staring at a blank phone screen that had just completely severed my ties to my entire family. I had absolutely no idea what official papers he was talking about. I had no idea what Grant had said to them. Back in our small, suffocating town, my brother was already playing the tragic, fiercely supportive hero. Within a single month, my parents began carefully altering their public story at the church and in the local grocery store. When nosy neighbors asked about my naval career, Judith would lower her eyes, sigh heavily, and whisper that the military was simply too much for my fragile nerves. They told everyone in town that I had quietly left the rigorous program and was desperately trying to find myself out on the West Coast. Meanwhile, Grant fully consolidated his stolen power. With my parents completely convinced of my deep disgrace and prolonged absence, he easily manipulated them into signing over temporary legal power of attorney regarding the family business and the inherited marshland, falsely claiming it was strictly necessary to protect the family assets from my supposed erratic behavior and massive debt. The entire town of Marlow Inlet collectively nodded in deep sympathy for the respectable Moore family, openly praising Grant for stepping up and carrying the heavy, shameful burden of his broken sister. That is exactly how a massive lie breathes. It requires a mastermind to plant the poisonous seed, but it requires a willing, prideful audience to let it grow in the dark. I secured a 48-hour Liberty Pass right after my unit completed a grueling readiness evaluation. I packed a single olive green duffel bag, bought a ticket at the station, and rode a commercial bus straight down the eastern coastline. The entire journey, I held on to a deeply human, profoundly naive belief. I genuinely thought that the massive wall of confusion between us was just a horrible byproduct of distance and bad telephone connections. I believed that if I simply stood in my family home, looked my parents directly in the eye, and presented myself as the capable, active-duty sailor I was, the entire bizarre nightmare would instantly dissolve. I was wrong. When I finally walked the 2 miles from the Marlow Inlet bus stop to my childhood home, I was not greeted on the front porch with a warm embrace. The house was entirely locked. I found them instead at Moore Marine Supply. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the front counter employee did not smile. He looked deeply uncomfortable and immediately pointed me toward the cramped, windowless office at the very back of the building. I walked down the narrow hallway. My chest felt incredibly tight. It did not feel like a daughter returning home from a long deployment. It felt exactly like walking into a hostile arbitration over a bitter contract dispute. My father, Warren, sat behind his massive oak desk, his large hands folded together resting on the scratched wood. My mother, Judith, stood rigidly by the dusty blinds of the small side window, refusing to make direct eye contact with me, and leaning casually against the metal filing cabinet, physically blocking the only exit, was Grant. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. "Sit down," Warren commanded. His voice held absolutely no warmth. I did not sit. I dropped my heavy canvas bag onto the concrete floor. "Dad, whatever Grant told you on the phone last month is completely insane. I am still in the Navy. I just finished my first major deployment." Warren did not argue. He simply reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the center of the desk. The heavy paper slapped against the wood. "Explain this." "Then," he said. I stepped forward and opened the cover. Sitting right on top was a stack of printed emails. I read the sender line. It was my secondary civilian account. I read the text of the first page. It was a pathetic, frantic message begging Grant for help, claiming I was failing my physical fitness tests and suffering from severe anxiety. I flipped to the next document. It was a formal-looking military form outlining a voluntary separation from the United States Navy due to acute psychological distress. I went entirely numb. The cold realization washed over me like freezing water. Grant had not simply lied to them over a quick phone call. He had meticulously fabricated an entire shadow history to assassinate my character. "I never wrote a single word of these emails," I said, my voice rising in panic. I grabbed the official form and held it up. "And this document is completely fake. Look at the unit identification code. It is entirely wrong. The Department of the Navy does not even use this specific typeface for separation orders. Dad, you have to look closely at this." Warren shook his head, his jaw clenching tight. "Stop it, Lillian. Just stop." We saw the electronic signatures. We read the dates. "Do you have any idea how much it hurts to see you stand right in front of me and continue to lie to my face to cover up your own shame?" "It is not shame," I shouted, slapping the paper back down onto the desk. "I am telling you the truth. Grant forged every single piece of this garbage." Grant pushed off the filing cabinet and took a slow step forward. He held both of his hands up, palms facing outward, playing the perfect, gentle peacemaker. "It is okay, Lily," he said softly. "You do not have to fight anymore. The pressure out there was too much. We understand. No one in this room hates you for failing. We just want to help you get back on your feet." His voice was so incredibly calm, so perfectly modulated, that it made my entirely justified anger look exactly like the mental instability he had written about in those fake emails. "Do not speak to me," I snapped at him, my hands shaking with pure rage. I turned to my mother. "Mom, you know me. Look at me. Do I look like someone who suffered a nervous breakdown and has been hiding on a couch for 2 months?" Judith finally looked at me, but her eyes were filled with a terrifying mixture of pity and terror. She took a step back, clutching her cardigan tightly around her chest. "Please, Lillian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Grant told us how fragile you are right now. Please do not make this harder on your father. He has barely slept since we found out." Her words felt like a physical blow to the ribs. She was entirely possessed by Grant's narrative. I looked frantically back down at the desk, desperately searching for anything that would break the spell. I flipped the heavy military form over. Underneath it was a bank receipt. I froze. I picked it up and read the bright blue ink. It was a withdrawal slip from the local community bank. The amount was for $18,000. It was the exact sum of the childhood savings bonds my grandfather had left in my name. I read the memo line written at the bottom. It said, "Civilian Transition Support and Debt Consolidation." Right below that line were 2 signatures, Warren Moore and Judith Moore. "You emptied my savings account?" I asked, the sheer horror draining all the volume from my voice. "We had to," Warren defended quickly, his tone righteous and unyielding. "Grant told us you had racked up massive credit card debts trying to survive after you ran away from your command. He said the creditors were about to track you down and file charges. We signed the release so Grant could manage the funds and keep you out of a civilian jail. He has been taking care of your mess while you hid." The trap was so completely brilliant and so deeply evil that I could barely breathe. Grant had stolen my money to fund his new contracting business, and he had manipulated our parents into physically handing it to him under the guise of saving me from ruin. "He stole it," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. I glared directly at Grant, who just stared back with a perfectly blank, innocent expression. "He stole my money. He forged federal documents, and he is using both of you." Warren stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backward into the wall. He slammed both of his hands flat onto the desk. "I will not tolerate this," Warren roared, his face turning a deep, angry red. "I will not let you walk into my business, after abandoning your duty and embarrassing this family, and throw wild, malicious accusations at the only person who stepped up to save you. Grant has been working 80 hours a week, trying to build a future for this family while you were out there quitting." He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at the office door. "Pick up your bag. Get out of this room." Do not come back to this house until you are ready to stop playing the victim, admit your failure, and thank your brother for saving your life." I stared at the man who raised me. I realized in that exact moment that logic and evidence were entirely useless. Warren was not defending Grant. He was fiercely defending his own ego. If he admitted that Grant was a liar, he had to admit that he had been a fool, and that he had completely abandoned his daughter when she was actually succeeding. His pride simply would not allow that truth to exist. I bent down and picked up the heavy canvas strap of my duffel bag. I did not shed a single tear. The grief was instantly replaced by something cold and hard taking root in my chest. I turned around and placed my hand on the brass doorknob. Behind me, the quiet, brittle voice of my mother broke the silence one final time. "Lillian," Judith asked, her tone laced with a sudden, ugly suspicion, "did you only come back here tonight because you need more money?" That single sentence severed the very last invisible string holding me to my family. I did not turn around. I did not answer her. I opened the door, walked straight down the narrow hallway, and stepped out into the humid coastal night. I walked the 2 miles back to the bus station and bought a ticket heading north. I left Marlowe Inlet not because I was a coward running away from failure, but because I finally understood the brutal reality of the situation. The lie was no longer just Grant's creation. It had been officially fully adopted and fiercely protected by my parents' fragile pride. The journey back to my naval base felt entirely different than the hopeful ride down the coast. The profound grief of being discarded by my own parents did not explode into a messy, hysterical breakdown. Instead, it froze solid inside my chest. It became something hard, dense, and permanent. Sitting by the window of that commercial bus, watching the highway markers blur past in the dark, I made a quiet, absolute decision. I stopped waiting for my family to suddenly understand me. I stopped hoping for a miraculous moment of clarity where they would see through Grant's flawless charade. I realized that human emotions were incredibly fragile, easily manipulated, and ultimately unreliable. So, I turned my entire existence over to the only thing in my life that had never lied to me: the rigorous, verifiable standards of my work. When I reported back to my unit, I threw myself into my duties with a terrifying, singular focus. I requested the most demanding assignments. I routinely worked 16 hours a day. I immersed myself completely in the complex, high-stakes environments of military logistics, materiel control, and global supply chain management. I specialized in disaster response protocols. These were highly demanding fields that required a ruthlessly cold mind and a level of accuracy that bordered on the fanatical. In logistics, there was absolutely no room for a charming excuse or a persuasive, heartfelt story. If a forward operating base required 20,000 gallons of aviation fuel and 5 tons of medical supplies by 0600 hours, you either delivered the assets on time or you completely failed the mission. I never failed. The military ecosystem rewarded my exact type of obsessive precision. Over the next several years, my career advanced at an aggressive, uninterrupted pace. I spent my limited free time taking night classes, eventually earning my bachelor's degree in supply chain management. I immediately submitted my formal package for officer candidate school. The selection board saw my flawless enlisted record and accepted me on my first attempt. I traded my enlisted uniform for the bright gold bars of a naval ensign, and eventually, the silver bars of a lieutenant. I became the kind of officer senior commanders sought out when a massive departmental budget was bleeding money or a critical supply chain was severely broken. Because I had spent my entire youth silently organizing the chaotic ledgers of a marine supply store, I possessed a deeply ingrained, almost predatory instinct for finding numerical inconsistencies. Eventually, I was assigned to the Atlantic Material Readiness Directorate, an elite oversight command. Within my first year there, I built a formidable reputation. I was the officer who could stare at a stack of 3,000 complicated procurement vouchers and instantly spot the single, buried anomaly that a dozen other auditors had completely missed. I found safety in the absolute truth of data. Numbers never forged a signature, and spreadsheets never lied to protect their own pride. Yet, despite building a fortress of professional success, a small, pathetic remnant of my humanity tried one final time to bridge the massive gap Grant had created. 4 years after I walked out of my father's office, I decided to compile a comprehensive, undeniable record of my reality. I gathered my official commissioning documents, copies of my deployment orders, and my recent promotion certificates. I placed them all into a thick, protective binder. I mailed the package to Marlow Inlet via registered mail, legally requiring a direct signature upon delivery. I thought the sheer weight of federal evidence might finally crack my father's stubborn delusion. 2 weeks later, a heavy envelope arrived at my barracks. It was not a heartfelt letter of apology from my parents. It was a formal legal notice printed on thick, expensive watermark paper from a high-priced corporate law firm. "Dear Ms. Moore," the stark black text read, "we represent Grant Moore and Harbor Shield Recovery. You are hereby formally instructed to cease and desist all harassing communications directed at the Moore family. Your continued attempts to disrupt their lives and the daily operations of their business will result in immediate, severe civil litigation." I read the crisp paper exactly twice. I did not throw it away. I carefully folded the threat, locked it securely inside my personal safe, and accepted that the door to my past was permanently welded shut. While I was quietly securing naval assets across the globe, Grant was loudly building a massive commercial empire on the ashes of my reputation. Back in our coastal county, his company, Harbor Shield Recovery, was winning increasingly large municipal contracts for storm repair and infrastructure reinforcement. He was outfitting vast fleets of heavy trucks, hiring dozens of local construction crews, and making highly publicized financial donations to the Town Square Revitalization Project. He frequently appeared on the front page of the regional newspaper, smiling broadly as the ultimate, self-made symbol of community resilience. What I did not know at the time was the deeply sick, twisted foundation of his public persona. Grant was actively weaponizing my fabricated failure to build his own saintly brand. He regularly told wealthy investors and local politicians that his fierce, unrelenting drive to rebuild broken homes was fueled by the tragic heartbreak of watching his own sister break under the intense pressure of the real world. He masterfully painted himself as the noble, long-suffering brother who was forced to shoulder the heavy burdens of a military washout. He literally sold my stolen dignity to buy public trust. The theft went far beyond my stolen childhood savings bonds. During my 7th year of active duty, our grandfather quietly passed away. His legal will explicitly split 70 acres of pristine, undeveloped coastal marshland right down the middle between Grant and me. But Grant had spent years carefully documenting my supposed mental instability, my alleged massive debts, and my complete, shameful abandonment of the family. Using the fraudulent power of attorney, he had previously tricked my parents into signing, along with the fake military discharge papers he had woven into the county records. Grant easily convinced a local probate judge that I had completely forfeited all legal claims to the estate. He stripped my name from the property deed and took sole ownership of the land. The very next morning, he used that 70-acre parcel as prime collateral to secure a $5 million commercial expansion loan from a regional bank. I had been entirely methodically erased. I realized that I had lost infinitely more than just a biological relationship with my mother and father. The damage was total. I had lost my good name in my hometown. I had lost my legal assets and my inheritance. I had lost my own personal history. Grant had violently stripped away my fundamental right to tell the true story of my own life, replacing my reality with a pathetic, cowardly fiction that made him look like a local hero. But reading that cease and desist letter from his lawyer finalized a profound, irreversible shift within my mind. From that specific moment forward, I no longer wanted my parents to believe me out of some sudden, emotional burst of parental compassion. I did not want to sit on a porch, shedding tears and exchanging soft apologies. I wanted something far more permanent, something completely immune to Grant's charming manipulation. I wanted a public reckoning where the truth did not rely on love, trust, or the fragile pride of a small-town family. I wanted to build a case so flawlessly solid that one day, the truth would march straight into a room carrying audited files, federal stamps, and absolutely undeniable, catastrophic proof. My unit at the Atlantic Material Readiness Directorate was tasked with conducting a massive, cross-agency audit during the late fall. Following a particularly devastating coastal hurricane season, the Department of Defense allocated over $85 million for the emergency reconstruction of military family housing installations along the eastern seaboard. Federal law strictly mandated that a significant portion of those lucrative rebuilding contracts be awarded to veteran-owned small businesses. Where there is a massive influx of federal cash, there is always a corresponding surge of opportunistic fraud. I sat at my desk, staring at 3 glowing computer monitors, meticulously running forensic cross-checks on the hundreds of civilian subcontractors claiming priority veteran status. It was highly technical, deeply tedious work. I was actively scanning tax identification numbers, cross-referencing military service numbers with the Central Defense Database, and verifying corporate ownership percentages. It was precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday when a specific corporate file flagged an administrative error on my third screen. The automated system highlighted a discrepancy in a secondary bidding application. The company name was Harbor Shield Recovery. My right hand completely froze on the computer mouse. I stared at the stark black text on the bright white screen. The primary applicant was listed as Grant Moore, but the corporate charter, designed specifically to secure the highly competitive federal veteran preference, claimed the company was 51% owned by a co-founder. The name listed was L. Moore. The application explicitly stated this co-founder was a former United States Navy sailor who had been honorably discharged following a severe service-connected physical injury. A cold, sharp shiver traced its way straight down my spine. I bypassed the automated summary and manually pulled the complete, unredacted corporate application file from the secure government server. As the dozens of scanned pages slowly loaded onto my screen, the sheer magnitude of the deception materialized before my eyes. I saw the name Lillian Moore printed in bold black ink. I scrolled further down and saw my own signature, painstakingly forged over and over again on dozens of sworn federal certifications, liability waivers, and corporate equity agreements. Attached to the very back of the digital file was the absolute holy grail of military documentation, a DD Form 214. It is the official certificate of release or discharge from active duty. The document glowing on my screen was a spectacular forgery. It possessed the correct federal watermarks, but the internal service codes had been heavily manipulated. Attached right behind the forged discharge paper was a glossy, professionally written corporate biography. It was a grotesque, twisted funhouse mirror of my actual life. The biography boldly claimed that I had suffered a catastrophic knee injury during advanced tactical training, abruptly ending my promising military career. It painted a deeply emotional, entirely fabricated narrative about how my older brother, Grant, had heroically stepped in to help me launch this disaster recovery firm as a way to give me a renewed sense of purpose. He was actively using a fictionalized, deeply tragic version of my existence to steal millions of dollars from the United States government. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear or throw my coffee cup against the wall. The military had trained me to process catastrophic system failures with absolute, chilling logic. I immediately locked my computer terminal. I printed a single physical copy of the fraudulent application, placed it inside a red classified folder, and walked straight down the linoleum hallway to the office of my commanding officer. I stood at rigid attention in front of his wooden desk. "Captain," I said, my voice completely devoid of any inflection, "I must formally declare an immediate conflict of interest regarding an active federal audit, and I am requesting to be removed from the primary investigative team for the Harbor Shield recovery file." The captain frowned, lowering his reading glasses. "On what grounds, Commander?" "Because the primary suspect in this fraud investigation is my biological brother," I replied smoothly. "And the disabled Navy veteran he is currently using to illegally secure federal defense contracts is me, I am L. Moore, and as you know, I am currently on active duty. Within 48 hours, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service took complete jurisdictional control of the case. I was permanently walled off from accessing the investigation files to preserve the absolute integrity of the chain of evidence. However, I immediately transitioned from a logistical auditor into the government's most devastating key witness. My authentic, highly decorated service record became the literal key to breaking Grant's entire criminal empire wide open. Federal agents secured warrants and raided the corporate offices of Harbor Shield Recovery in Marlow Inlet. The forensic accountants began tearing through Grant's financial history like a pack of starving wolves. What the federal agents found buried beneath the surface was infinitely worse than simple contract fraud. The investigators mapped out a massive, interconnected web of severe financial crimes. They discovered exactly how Grant had used the forged documents to illegally seize the 70 acres of coastal marshland our grandfather had left us. But the most agonizing revelation came a week later, during a closed-door briefing with the lead federal prosecutor. The forensic team had traced a massive $2 million commercial mortgage tied directly to Moore Marine Supply, my family's legacy store. The prosecutor slid a photocopy of the commercial loan agreement across the metal table. I looked down and saw my parents' signatures sitting right at the bottom of the guarantor page. Warren and Judith Moore had voluntarily pledged their entire business, their life savings, and the physical building they had owned for 40 years, all to secure a massive line of credit for Grant. They had co-signed the crushing debt because Grant had convinced them that Harbor Shield Recovery was built to honor the family name and to privately support their deeply troubled, disgraced daughter. My parents had signed that document believing they were somehow redeeming the family honor after my supposed catastrophic failure. That specific piece of paper completely shifted my understanding of the past decade. Grant's original lie had not merely robbed me of a family. It had systematically transformed my own mother and father into his unwitting financial hostages. They were entirely trapped in his collapsing house of cards. If Grant's company failed, the regional bank would immediately foreclose on the marine supply store. They would lose absolutely everything they had built over 4 decades. My brother had intentionally tethered their financial survival directly to his massive criminal fraud. I sat in that sterile briefing room, staring at the dark ink on the loan document. The heavy, suffocating reality of the situation settled firmly onto my shoulders. I clearly understood the catastrophic chain reaction that was about to occur. If I agreed to testify, if I formally authenticated my true service record and exposed the forged discharge papers, Grant's empire would instantly disintegrate. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary. But the blast radius would be absolute. The bank would seize my parents' store. My mother and father would be violently dragged out of their comfortable, protected bubble of small-town ignorance. The entire population of Marlow Inlet would finally discover that the proud Moore family had blindly trusted a sociopath and completely abandoned their innocent daughter. The prosecutor watched me carefully. Knowing the immense personal weight of the choice in front of me, she asked if I was fully prepared to proceed as the primary witness for the federal government. For years, I had desperately wanted my parents to simply believe my words, to choose my truth over his comfortable lie. But those days of begging for their emotional validation were entirely gone. The truth was no longer a desperate plea whispered in a back office. The truth was now a heavily documented, federally audited weapon that could definitively win inside a courtroom. Yes, I told the prosecutor, my voice as hard and unyielding as polished steel. Draft the subpoenas. We are going to trial. 3 weeks before the federal indictments were officially unsealed, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored the call, but when I answered, the voice on the other end belonged to a ghost. It was Grant. He did not sound like the arrogant, untouchable golden boy of Marlow Inlet anymore. His voice was incredibly tight, carefully measured, and completely stripped of its usual commanding resonance. He told me he had driven 400 miles and was currently sitting in a civilian coffee shop just outside the main gates of my naval base. He practically begged for 20 minutes of my time. He said we needed to sit down and talk like a real family before the lawyers completely destroyed everything we had left. I agreed to meet him, not out of any lingering sibling affection, but because a very cold, analytical part of my brain wanted to look the architect of my destruction directly in the eyes. I walked into the crowded, noisy cafe wearing my daily working uniform. Grant was sitting alone in a corner booth. He looked visibly aged. The expensive, custom-tailored suit could not hide the dark circles under his eyes or the frantic, nervous energy constantly vibrating through his hands. When I sat down across from him, he did not offer a single word of genuine apology for stealing a decade of my life. Instead, he leaned forward, tightly laced his fingers together on the table, and immediately launched into a practiced, corporate defense. "Lily, things have gotten completely out of hand," Grant whispered, anxiously glancing around as if federal agents were hiding behind the espresso machines. "The government is entirely misinterpreting the foundation of Harbor Shield. When I filed those initial corporate charters, it was only supposed to be a temporary arrangement. A bridge loan to get the family business through a really tough financial quarter. I never intended to cut you out permanently." I stared at him in absolute silence. The sheer, unyielding audacity of his lie was almost breathtaking. "You forged federal military discharge papers. Grant," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You stole my inheritance. You looked our parents in the eye and told them I had a complete psychological collapse." He waved his hand dismissively, as if my completely ruined reputation was just a minor clerical error that could be easily amended. "I was protecting you if I had told them you were actually succeeding. Dad would have felt deeply threatened by your independence. I gave them a tragic story they could handle. And yes, the paperwork was a massive mistake. But look at you now. You have a fantastic career. You are a senior officer. You won. I am just asking you to tell the federal investigators that we had a verbal agreement. Tell them I simply misunderstood your legal status regarding the Veteran Preference Program. If you testify against me, the bank immediately takes the store. Mom and Dad will lose absolutely everything." I looked closely at the man sitting across the small wooden table. I saw right through the polished, desperate veneer. He was not remotely sorry for destroying my youth or erasing my good name in our hometown. He was absolutely terrified of losing his massive house, his lucrative company, and his pristine status as the town's savior. He viewed our parents entirely as human shields, strategically deploying their potential financial ruin to violently force my silence. "There is no verbal agreement," I told him, my voice barely above a whisper, but cutting through the cafe noise like a sharp razor. "I will swear a binding oath on the witness stand, and I will hand the jury the absolute truth. Do not ever contact me again." I stood up from the booth and walked out into the sunlight. I did not look back. My firm refusal triggered an immediate, desperate pivot in his survival strategy. By the time Grant drove the 400 miles back to Marlow Inlet, he had already crafted a brand new, highly toxic narrative for our parents. If I was no longer the tragic, broken failure, I had to immediately become the villain. He convinced them that I had secretly built a highly successful military career and was now returning out of pure, vindictive jealousy to aggressively dismantle his hard-earned business. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from my mother. I sat alone in my quiet quarters and listened to the audio file. Judith sounded incredibly frail, her voice trembling with a sickening mixture of fear and deep, misplaced reproach. "Lillian," my mother said on the recording, her breath hitching nervously, "Grant told us exactly what you are trying to do with those federal auditors. I simply do not understand you. If you are truly doing so well up there, if you really are an officer now, why must you come back and destroy your brother? He has worked so incredibly hard for this community. Please, if you have any decency left in your heart, do not tear this family apart over some old, petty jealousy. Leave us alone." The message ended with a sharp, electronic click. I sat in the absolute silence of my room. She still fiercely believed him, even when faced with the undeniable reality of my professional success. She instinctively chose to view me as a malicious threat, rather than a victim of a massive, coordinated fraud. It was a soft, suffocating kind of pain. But the most sickening validation of my resolve arrived the very next morning. An old high school neighbor, someone who had always been quietly skeptical of the perfect Moore family dynamics, secretly mailed me a physical photograph. It was a glossy promotional flyer for a local charity fundraiser hosted by Harbor Shield Recovery just 1 week prior. Right there, printed in bold letters under Grant's smiling face, was a heartfelt paragraph dedicated to the brave men and women of the armed forces. The final sentence read, "Dedicated in honor of my younger sister, who courageously attempted to serve her country, but lost her way. Her struggle inspires our daily mission." He was still actively monetizing my fake trauma. He was shamelessly selling my forged failure to extract financial donations and public goodwill from the local community. Any lingering trace of hesitation I held was completely eradicated when the federal cyber forensics team completed their final, devastating technical report. The digital investigators had successfully subpoenaed the internet service provider records for Grant's contracting office. They mapped the exact internet protocol addresses used to create and send those frantic, pathetic emails that had supposedly come from my civilian account all those years ago. The dates and the timestamps lined up flawlessly. The government now had irrefutable, hard evidence proving that those fake emails were drafted and sent from a desktop computer sitting directly on Grant's private desk. The prosecution then cross-referenced those exact dates with my official naval deployment schedule. On the very days those emails were sent, my ship was operating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, strictly maintaining a condition of total radio silence during a massive tactical exercise. I had absolutely zero access to any external communication networks. The digital alibi was perfectly ironclad, but the forensic deep dive unearthed one massive, highly volatile complication. Buried deep inside the thick stack of fraudulent property transfers and corporate charters, the investigators found a preliminary legal document. It was a temporary transfer of power regarding the family store, and right on the witness line, signed in bright blue ink, was the authentic signature of Judith Moore. The lead prosecutor called me into a secure conference room to seriously discuss the finding. The legal implication was severe. Grant had clearly manipulated our mother into signing the document under false pretenses, later maliciously altering the paperwork to grant himself total financial control. But legally speaking, her real name was on a document actively used in a massive federal fraud scheme. The prosecutor calmly explained that they could easily use that specific signature to apply crushing legal leverage. They could formally charge Judith as a co-conspirator to force Grant into accepting an early unconditional plea deal. I sat at the cold metal table, staring down at my mother's shaky handwriting. The easiest, most universally destructive path was right there in front of me. I could simply let the federal government completely bulldoze my parents. I could let them face the terrifying, very real threat of a criminal indictment for blindly enabling my brother. It would have been the ultimate, scorched earth revenge. "No," I told the prosecutor firmly, pushing the document back across the table. "My mother is a socially anxious woman who barely understands how to operate a cellular phone, let alone execute a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. She signed that paper because her son aggressively told her it was strictly necessary to save me from total bankruptcy. She had absolutely zero criminal intent. I wanted explicitly noted in the final file that Judith Moore is a victim of financial manipulation, not a willing participant." The prosecutor nodded slowly, clearly respecting the hard boundary I had just drawn. I walked out of the federal building feeling a profound, chilling sense of clarity. Sparing my mother from the threat of a federal prison was not an act of gentle, loving forgiveness. It was the purest, most agonizing form of justice I could possibly deliver. If I let the government destroy my parents, they would forever view themselves as tragic martyrs, unfairly persecuted by a cold federal bureaucracy and a deeply hateful daughter. They would never actually have to face the brutal reality of their own parenting failures. By actively protecting their legal freedom, I ensured they would be forced to sit in that courtroom gallery, completely awake and fully aware. I was not going to destroy my family. I was going to let them live long enough and remain lucid enough to watch the golden sun they foolishly worshipped get systematically dismantled by the daughter they so easily threw away. They were going to have to look directly at the absolute ruin of their own creation. The reckoning had finally arrived. Earlier that morning, Warren and Judith Moore walked up the wide concrete steps of the federal courthouse with their heads held high. They linked arms, bracing themselves against the brisk morning air and the heavy emotional burden of the day. In their minds, they were stepping onto a battlefield to fiercely protect their successful, self-made son from a vindictive, estranged daughter. Grant had spent the last 3 weeks carefully preparing them for this exact, twisted narrative. He had warned them repeatedly that I was returning not out of any sense of justice, but out of a toxic, bitter jealousy aimed at destroying the family legacy. He deliberately kept the prosecution witness list a closely guarded secret from them, knowing perfectly well that if they had even a fraction of a warning, his carefully constructed house of cards would completely collapse before the judge even entered the room. They took their seats in the front row of the gallery, fully prepared to face a disgraced civilian woman hardened by years of failure. They had absolutely no idea they were about to face a senior military officer. Now, sitting on the elevated witness stand, the absolute magnitude of that shock was still echoing violently through the silent room. When I had pushed through those double doors in my pristine dress whites, the air had physically left my parents' lungs. Warren, a man who had spent his entire life rigidly enforcing his own strict version of reality, could no longer sit up straight. His broad shoulders slumped heavily against the hard wooden bench, as if the gravity in the courtroom had suddenly doubled. Beside him, Judith was taking incredibly shallow, rapid breaths. Her eyes were wide, fixed entirely on the bright gold oak leaves resting heavily on my collar and the colorful rows of service ribbons pinned to my chest. At the defense table, Grant sat completely frozen. He forced his jaw into a tight, confident line, desperately trying to maintain the polished illusion of control, but his hands trembled slightly against the mahogany table, and his eyes betrayed a wild, cornered panic. He stubbornly refused to look back at the gallery. He knew his parents were staring at the back of his neck. The entire room could feel the tectonic plates of power violently shifting beneath his feet. Prosecutor Sarah Vance stepped up to the wooden podium in the center of the floor. She did not waste any time with theatrical pacing or dramatic pauses. She moved with surgical, devastating precision. "Lieutenant Commander Moore," Vance began, her voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "Could you please detail your exact timeline of military service for the official record? I was commissioned as an ensign in 2014. I answered smoothly, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade 2 years later, lieutenant in year 2018, and lieutenant commander last year. I have been on continuous active duty for exactly 12 years. At any point during those 12 years, did you ever request a voluntary separation due to acute psychological distress?" Vance asked, her eyes briefly flicking toward the defense table. "No," I stated firmly. "Were you ever administratively separated for a failure to adapt to strict military standards?" "Absolutely not," I replied. "My service record is entirely uninterrupted, highly decorated, and fully documented." Vance turned toward the large digital monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. With the quick press of a button, 2 distinct documents appeared side by side on the bright screen. On the left was my authentic, heavily authenticated military service record. On the right was the fraudulent discharge form Grant had used to illegally secure his massive federal contracts and to manipulate our family out of my inheritance. "Members of the jury, please look closely at the screens provided," Vance directed calmly. The differences between the 2 files were not just minor clerical errors. They were glaring, undeniable blunders that any rational adult could easily spot. The dates of service on the fake document actively overlapped with verified, classified combat deployments on my real military record. The unit identification codes typed on Grant's version were completely fictional, belonging to absolutely no command in the entire United States Navy. The typeface used on the forged document was a standard commercial font found on any basic home computer, totally different from the strict, highly formatted typography required by the Department of Defense. And right at the bottom, my signature was blatantly copied and pasted, lacking the natural pressure, fading, and flow of a human hand holding a pen. From my high vantage point, I watched my father stare intently at that glowing screen. Warren was a pragmatic man who inherently understood physical inventory, sequential serial numbers, and hard data. He was currently looking at undeniable, empirical proof of massive fraud. For the very first time in over a decade, he was seeing me clearly. He was not looking at a distorted, shameful memory of a fragile girl who ran away from hard work. He was looking at a mature, highly capable woman who possessed the senior rank, the documented federal achievements, and the cold, unyielding discipline that a quitter could never possibly achieve. The rigid, stubborn certainty that had defined his entire worldview was actively shattering into pieces right in front of him, but the heaviest legal and emotional blow was yet to fall. Vance switched the display on the monitor. A printed email appeared on the screen. It was the exact message Grant had placed on my father's desk all those years ago. It was the desperate, pathetic plea for help, claiming I was failing my physical tests and suffering a complete mental breakdown. "Commander Moore, did you author this specific email?" Vance asked. "I did not," I answered, my voice echoing like a gavel strike. Vance turned respectfully toward the judge. "Your Honor, as stipulated in the pretrial cyber forensics report submitted into evidence as Exhibit 42, the federal government has definitively traced the digital origin of this specific communication. The digital investigators formally confirmed that this email was drafted and sent from an Internet Protocol address registered directly to the private corporate office of Harbor Shield Recovery. Furthermore, the digital timestamp proves beyond any doubt that it was sent on a Tuesday afternoon when Commander Moore was deployed on a naval vessel operating under strict emission control conditions in the Atlantic Ocean. She had absolutely zero physical or technical access to any internet networks on that date." Those specific words dropped into the courtroom like heavy anvils. I looked directly past the lawyers and locked eyes with my mother. Judith sat completely paralyzed in the front row of the gallery. Her face was entirely drained of all color, making her look incredibly frail and instantly older. She was staring blankly at the projection of that pathetic, pleading email. That specific digital message was the exact catalyst that had initially broken her heart. It was the exact set of carefully chosen words that had convinced her to completely abandon me, to publicly mourn me while I was still very much alive, and to unquestioningly hand her entire financial future over to her older son. Grant swallowed hard, tugging nervously at the stiff collar of his expensive dress shirt. He tried to project a look of stoic, misunderstood defiance for the jury, but his eyes kept sliding away from the gallery. He was completely unable to meet the burning, devastated stare of his parents sitting just 3 feet behind him. The ultimate, crushing realization finally washed over Judith Moore in real time. The shameful, heartbreaking words that had actively pushed her to turn her back on her only daughter were not written by a broken, terrified sailor. They were meticulously typed out by the golden sun sitting right in front of her. Designed entirely to manipulate a mother's deepest love and weaponize her fear for pure, unadulterated financial gain. The afternoon session of the trial violently shifted focus from the theft of my identity to the massive, sprawling theft of federal capital. Prosecutor Sarah Vance called a seasoned forensic accountant to the stand to painstakingly trace the illicit cash flow. The financial expert spent 2 grueling hours breaking down the complex, parasitic architecture of Harbor Shield Recovery. She explicitly showed the jury how Grant had illegally pledged the 70 acres of coastal marshland inherited from our grandfather. By forging my signature on the warranty deed, he secured an initial $3 million commercial line of credit. He did not stop there. The accountant presented the financial disbursement records for 12 separate government contracts. Grant had heavily leveraged the fake 51% veteran ownership status to skip the standard bidding lines, siphoning off millions of dollars meant for legitimate service members. He used my stolen valor as a golden key to unlock the federal treasury. Then, the prosecution called a senior loan officer from the regional bank. The man adjusted his glasses and confirmed the most devastating collateral damage of Grant's empire. He testified that my parents had voluntarily signed a secondary mortgage, pledging more marine supply in the physical brick building they had owned for 40 years. When Vance asked the banker what justification Grant had provided for this massive financial risk, the answer sucked the remaining air out of the gallery. Mr. Moore explicitly told his parents that his younger sister had accrued catastrophic medical and psychological debts after abandoning her military post. The banker read from his official meeting notes. He convinced them that the $1,500,000 secondary mortgage was strictly necessary to consolidate her civilian debts and protect the family from aggressive collection agencies. Sitting in the gallery, my mother let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. My parents had literally bet their entire life's work, their retirement, and their legacy on a desperate bid to save a daughter who never actually needed saving. They were completely financially handcuffed to the very fraud that erased me. But the absolute cruelest revelation was not found in the bank ledgers. Vance requested the courtroom lights be dimmed. She turned on the large digital monitors and played a series of promotional videos and local news clips spanning the past 5 years. The high-definition footage showed Grant standing at various charity galas, community fundraisers, and ribbon-cutting ceremonies across the county. In every single video, he wore a tailored suit and a somber, deeply compassionate expression. He stood at wooden podiums and masterfully delivered the exact same emotional speech. He spoke about the devastating and visible wounds of military service. He talked about his brilliant younger sister, who had tragically cracked under the immense pressure of naval training, losing her way and her purpose. He told the wealthy donors and the local politicians that his entire disaster relief company was founded to honor my struggle, to provide stable jobs for veterans, and to build a community safety net so no one else would ever fall through the cracks like I did. It was a breathtakingly evil manipulation. My fabricated downfall was not just the administrative tool he used to steal property, it was his primary marketing content. He had actively weaponized my fake tragedy to manufacture a lucrative moral halo for himself. He sold my supposed mental breakdown to extract money, trust, and public adoration. When the lights came back on, the courtroom was dead silent. The jury looked physically disgusted. "The government calls Warren Moore to the stand," Vance announced. My father stood up slowly. He looked incredibly frail, as if he had aged 10 years in the span of 4 hours. He walked heavily to the witness box, took the oath, and sat down. He refused to look at Grant. Vance approached the podium gently but firmly. She asked him to explain exactly why the family had accepted the fraudulent discharge papers without ever contacting the Department of the Navy for verification. Warren gripped the wooden rail of the witness box. His knuckles were bone white. For a long, agonizing minute, he stared straight ahead at the wood paneling. When he finally spoke, his deep voice cracked with an unbearable, suffocating weight. "Grant brought the paperwork to the house," Warren testified, each word pulled from his throat like broken glass. "He brought the emails. He told us she was deeply ashamed. I saw the official seals on the discharge forms. But the truth is, I did not call the military because I did not want to hear the answers. I had already made up my mind about my daughter before she even left for basic training. I told her not to quit, and when Grant told me she did, it just confirmed every unfair, rigid assumption I ever held." He finally turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, filled with a crushing, irreversible regret. "I thought I was upholding the strict principles of this family," Warren said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that echoed loudly through the microphones. "I thought I was protecting our dignity by cutting out a failure. But I was not protecting any principles at all. I was just protecting my own stupid, massive pride. I could not stand the idea that I had misjudged her strength. I chose to believe a comfortable lie because the truth would have forced me to admit I was a terrible father. The raw, unfiltered honesty of his confession hung heavily in the air. It was a brutal self-assessment from a man who had built his entire life on being right, desperate to salvage any remaining shred of credibility. The defense immediately called Grant to the stand. Grant walked up with a tight, nervous energy. Under the gentle questioning of his own high-priced attorney, he did not completely deny the forged documents, as the technical evidence was simply too overwhelming. Instead, he attempted to aggressively pivot the narrative. "I never intended to hurt my family," Grant pleaded to the jury, his voice laced with manufactured desperation. The coastal economy was crashing. The marine supply store was losing money fast. I filed those papers as a temporary bridge. I just needed the initial capital to get Harbor Shield off the ground so I could carry the financial burden for all of us. I always planned to pay Lillian back her share. The business simply exploded. The contracts got bigger, and the lie just spiraled completely out of my control. I was trapped by my own success. It was a classic, calculated defense strategy admit to the minor administrative sin to excuse the massive predatory felony. But Sarah Vance was holding the ultimate trump card. She approached the podium for cross-examination holding a single sheet of paper. "Mr. Moore, you claim this was a temporary, desperate measure that simply got out of hand," Vance said sharply. "You claim you were deeply trapped by the lie." "Yes," Grant insisted, nodding solemnly. "That is correct." "Then please explain Government Exhibit 94, Vance said, handing a copy to the judge and projecting it onto the large screen. It was an internal corporate email sent from Grant to his silent financial partner exactly 4 years ago, just weeks before I had mailed my authentic military records to my parents. Vance read the highlighted text aloud. "Do not worry about the upcoming federal ownership audit. I have the veteran preference completely locked down. As long as my parents still believe she quit, no one will dare ask deep questions. They will guard the secret out of their own embarrassment. We are untouchable." Grant went entirely pale. His mouth opened, but he could not form a single word. He had effectively cut off his own escape route. The email proved beyond any reasonable doubt that there was absolutely no guilt, no sense of being trapped, and no intention of ever making things right. It was a cold, calculated, ongoing predation. He had knowingly weaponized our parents' shame as a tactical shield to protect his criminal enterprise. The defense had absolutely no further questions. Grant stepped down from the box, looking completely hollowed out, the arrogant facade entirely stripped away, leaving only the reality of a manipulative thief exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The judge banged his wooden gavel, signaling the end of the evidentiary phase. He looked down from his high bench, his expression stern and resolute. "The court has heard the full extent of the evidence," the judge announced. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for closing arguments and the final verdict. However, before this court reaches its final conclusion, I am granting the prosecution's special motion. Lieutenant Commander Moore will be permitted to deliver a formal victim impact statement directly to this court." I sat perfectly still in my chair, smoothing the white fabric of my uniform trousers. The financial ledgers were closed, the digital forensics were settled, but the real reckoning, the final, devastating blow that could never be quantified on a bank statement, was reserved entirely for tomorrow. The final morning of the trial arrived with a heavy, suffocating weight that settled over the entire gallery. I stepped up to the podium in the center of the courtroom for my victim impact statement. My white uniform remained completely spotless and perfectly creased. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. When I spoke, I did not mention my gold oak leaves, my commendations, or my professional success. None of that mattered here. "Your Honor," I began, looking directly at the judge. "Grant Moore did not merely commit financial fraud. He committed a systematic erasure of my life. He did not just take 70 acres of coastal land or drain my childhood savings accounts. He took away the fundamental right to tell the true story of my own existence. I paused, letting the microphone carry my voice to the very back of the room. I did not look at my brother. I looked straight ahead. Because of his meticulously planned deception, I lost an entire decade with my family. I was not allowed to attend my grandfather's funeral. I was completely written out of my own family history. I became a cautionary tale in my hometown, a pathetic ghost used to extract charity and build a false corporate empire. But the deepest, most profound pain of the last 12 years was not the fact that a greedy man told a lie. I finally turned my head and looked directly at the front row of the gallery, locking eyes with my mother and father. The absolute deepest pain was that the people I loved the most actively chose to believe that lie, simply because a story of my failure was far easier to accept than the reality of my strength. My mother let out a quiet, shattered sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. My father stared at me, tears silently tracking down his weathered face, completely stripped of his lifelong pride. But the final, fatal blow of the trial did not come from my speech. It came during the prosecution's closing remarks. Sarah Vance, holding a newly subpoenaed digital file, approached the bench. "Your Honor, the government has one final piece of evidence regarding the defendant's character and intent," Vance stated firmly. She projected a confidential commercial real estate prospectus onto the large screen. It was a complete, highly detailed liquidation plan for Moore Marine Supply. "The financial forensics team recovered this file from the defendant's private server late last night," Vance explained, turning to face the jury. Grant Moore was fully prepared to sell the physical brick building and the 40-year-old family business to a commercial developer the exact moment his final massive federal loan was securely rolled over. He was going to completely liquidate his parents' entire livelihood to cover his own corporate deficits. The collective gasp in the courtroom was audible. I watched my father physically collapse inward. The rigid spine that had held Warren Moore together for 60 years finally snapped. Judith grabbed his arm as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath them. In that singular, brutal second, my parents realized they were never the protected beneficiaries of Grant's success. They were merely temporary assets on his balance sheet, waiting to be sold off just like my stolen name. They had blindly protected a predator who was quietly preparing to slaughter them. The judge did not need long to deliberate. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sound cracked like a rifle shot. "Grant Moore," the judge announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "I find you guilty of massive federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, multiple counts of document forgery, and perjury regarding your fraudulent claims of veteran business status. You are ordered to pay full financial restitution to the United States government. You are permanently banned from ever participating in federal contracting." The judge then turned his attention to the civil remedies. "Furthermore, this court officially nullifies all property transfers and commercial mortgages executed under the forged signature of Lillian Moore. The 70 acres of coastal marshland are immediately restored to their rightful, original co-owner. As for the Moore Marine Supply Store, the secondary mortgage secured through fraudulent pretenses is hereby frozen. The business will be placed under a court-supervised restructuring plan to ensure the senior Moores do not lose their entire livelihood due to the predatory actions of their son." 2 federal marshals stepped forward and placed heavy steel handcuffs on Grant's wrists. The metallic clicks echoed loudly. The golden boy of Marlowe Inlet did not look back at his family as they led him through the side door. He was finally, permanently reduced to the criminal he had always been. When the gallery dismissed, I walked out into the wide marble hallway. I stopped near the heavy brass doors. I heard the slow, shuffling footsteps behind me. Warren and Judith approached slowly. They looked completely broken, stripped of their small-town arrogance and their protective illusions. My father stopped 3 feet away. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Lillian, I do not have the right words. I do not have any excuses left. We were completely wrong." My mother reached out a shaking hand, her eyes pleading for a sudden, tearful embrace that would magically wash away 12 years of betrayal. "Please, sweetheart," she whispered, "we can fix this. We can be a family again." I looked at them. The anger was gone, but so was the desperate, childlike need for their approval. I did not give them the easy, cinematic reconciliation they desperately craved. "You are my parents," I told them calmly, my voice steady and completely even. "That is a biological fact that will never change. I made sure the bank did not take your store today, because I do not want to see you destroyed, but blood only makes us relatives. Trust is a completely different currency, and you chose to spend all of yours on a lie. Tears will not magically rebuild a decade of abandonment." I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked away. The true beauty of my revenge was not simply sending Grant to a federal prison. It was what I built from the ashes of his empire. Once the legal dust settled, and my legal rights to the 70 acres of marshland were fully restored, I immediately sold my half of the prime waterfront property to a legitimate conservation group. I took every single dollar of that massive sale and established the Moore Harbor Scholarship. I created a fully funded permanent financial trust specifically designed to pay for the college tuition and technical training of young women from small coastal towns who wanted to pursue careers in heavy logistics, mechanical engineering, and military service. I took the exact assets Grant used to erase my existence and transformed them into a permanent, undeniable legacy bearing my true name. Every single year, a new generation of capable, highly disciplined women would leave Marlowe Inlet fully funded by my victory. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the bright, blinding afternoon sun. I walked down the wide concrete steps, my white uniform gleaming in the daylight. Behind me, standing in the shadows of the doorway, my parents watched me go. For the very first time in my entire life, they were forced to tilt their heads up and look at the real version of their daughter, forged in absolute truth, instead of the pathetic fiction they had bought from a liar. The heavy knot in my chest finally untied itself. It was a late, incredibly painful resolution, but it was completely, undeniably mine. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, share your city or country in the comments, and subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories for more.